Hello and welcome to CICD Test. I'm Roshan, your test automation coach. So guys, the topic for this video is identifying a web element using Xpath and CSS selectors. It is very important to learn both in parallel because there is a lot similarity between them, and also they are the two ways in which someone will identify a web element. You have to create a journey of a test case and you have to complete the test case automation. Then you have to identify what particular web element should do what exactly needs to be done. The syntax for XPath is right in front of your screen right now. So guys, we will be using exactly the same syntax for creating our XPath. Let us simply inspect the whole web page, and what you will see in front of your screen right now is this is the Chrome Dev Toolbar, and let's say I have to identify this particular web element, and this is an input field. This is the input tag that it is associated with, and just to write our XPath, keeping the focus on this particular toolbar itself, we will simply press Control F, and we will be having this particular bar in front of us, find by string selector or XPath bar. So let's just start writing the XPath. We'll start with double forward slash. We'll write the tag name as the input tag itself. Let us simply identify it again to keep the focus alive. So yeah, this is our target. This is the input tag. See, ignore this yellow highlighted web element because it is simply showing us that this is the first input web element in the whole HTML page out of the 6 that are present here. Okay, so now we will simply start writing the attributes information inside this square bracket. We'll start with @sign, and we will write the attribute name. Let us pick the attribute name as ID. Now, if we'll pick this attribute name, then this is what we have to do. We will simply write ID is equals to, within the single quotes, we will write the ID value here. We will copy this ID value and we will paste it here and see 1 of 1. So ID is, of course, it is the most unique attribute ever present on the HTML to identify the web elements. And this is how we have identified the right web element. How we can say that this is the right XPath, because it is showing 1 of 1. This is the unique XPath that we have written for this particular web element, that is the input field. Now let's just say that we have to identify the same input field using the CSS selector. We simply, there is no need to write all these things inside the CSS selectors. It will simply be identified by using a hash key. See guys, if it is an ID, then we will simply use the hash key to identify that ID, and we will write the ID value in front of the hash key, that is email in this case, and we'll write email, and this CSS selector will identify this particular web element, the input field, right away. See, 1 of 1. So this is the syntax difference between the XPath and the CSS selectors. With XPath, we have to give complete detailing, and in CSS selectors, it gets way simpler. Now, what we will try and do is we will try and identify this second input field, which is the password field. First, we will try and find this by XPath. So using XPath, we will start with the double forward slash. We will type the input tag. We will start the attribute name inside the square brackets, and we equate it with the value in single quotes, and we will simply pick the value of class here, and we'll copy the complete value of class and we'll paste it here. See, 1 of 1 again. So this is the same thing that we have done for ID, just by changing the name here, the attribute name here, and we have provided the value against the ID, which was mentioned against the ID attribute itself, and it was working exactly the same way. It was highlighting the right web element. Now doing the same thing using the CSS selector. Now what exactly is the syntax for CSS selectors to identify a web element using the class attribute? Now here we simply have to use a dot to identify a class of a web element. We will simply press dot and we'll copy the class value for this particular web element. What we see is there is a huge value that we have simply copy and pasted in our XPath value inside the double quotes itself, and the same thing we will be doing here, and it won't work, guys. Why? I'll tell you just after the pasting is done. See, now, there is no highlight of the web element, right? So, why is it so? See guys, every class is separated with a space here. So, every space denotes that the class has ended and the embedded class has started here. So, if you will add or replace this space with a dot and you'll do for all the classes the same way, what you'll see, the CSS selector is denoting one of the web element, which is the exact web element we were looking for. So this is the difference between the syntax of XPath and CSS selectors. One more important thing is the difference between the absolute and relative XPath. This is the most important and the favorite question of the interviewer for the beginners. So guys, there is a difference between absolute XPath and the relative XPath. For the relative XPath, it is exactly what we have done so far in this video. This is what the relative XPath means. Relative XPath means identifying a web element using your own methods, using your own syntax, and writing the XPath yourself to identify a web element on a web page. Unlike this, in Absolute XPath or Absolute CSS selectors, we'll simply right click on this web elements code, HTML code, and we'll copy the XPath from here, copy XPath, and we'll simply paste it here. See, again, it is doing the same thing. Then why exactly we use the relative XPath and why not the Absolute XPath? Guys, Absolute XPath is sometimes too huge and it is very much dependent on the present state of the HTML page. Now, let's say if your developer has added new input field inside this using the same embedded class. Now, guys, it is very important for you to understand that these kind of changes will affect your code if you pick the absolute XPath. Picking the absolute XPath for your project is the worst thing you can ever do to your project, guys. See, whenever the new code is applied on that web page, there are huge chances that that particular absolute XPath will change. So this is the reason that we write our relative XPath so that we are able to identify the right web element even if the HTML structure changes after the upload of the new code. So we try to keep it as robust as possible by writing it by ourselves. Now, if you want to see the CSS selector for the same web element, so we simply have to again go to that same web element and again right click, copy CSS selector, copy selector, and you have to simply paste it here and see the CSS selector have picked ID here. But if you'll pick any other thing on this web page, let's see, if we are picking this particular text on this web page, then let's copy the CSS selector for this, or let's just copy the XPath for this and simply let's just paste it here. See, this is the complete absolute XPath of this particular web element. See, it is huge, guys. See, this particular web element has such a huge absolute XPath and it is so dangerous to keep it this way inside your code. This might have changes like say after 2 or 3 builds are incorporated in this particular web page. Now, what if I have to write the XPath, the relative XPath of this particular web element? So we will delete this absolute XPath, it's of no use. We will pick this web element and we will copy the text of this web element. Now we will use this text in our XPath. We will start our XPath using the font tag, and inside the square brackets we will not use any attribute now. We will be using the text method. The XPath of this syntax will be in front of your screen by now, and we will be using the same syntax. We'll be using the text method. To identify this method, we will be using the curved brackets, and we will be using the equate operator, and the value of this text will be residing inside single quotes. We'll simply paste this value here and see again 1 of 1. So see, there is a huge difference in that absolute XPath that we have seen earlier just now, and this XPath, this relative XPath that we have written by ourselves. Now chances are very less that if the code changes tomorrow for this particular web page, then this XPath will fall short of identifying this particular web element. So this is why we use the relative XPath. So that's it for this video. I'm Roshan signing off. Keep watching CICD tests and keep learning.